Welcome to Cipher After Hours. I'm Brett Stewart, along with my co-hosts, Emily and David, and we are going to continue our discussion about Project Red Dog. I think we're going to get into interacting with the undiscovered artifact. We're going to go into the data surrounding that, as well as the consequences of interacting with it. But before we jump into those remote viewing processes, I think good place to start would be to go into some of the why. Why was this thing made and who built it? Was it just a religious thing, or was there some bigger purpose? And there's certainly some interesting elements here in regards to this particular site.
We talked about it a little bit in the main show, but I think that we've got some more salacious details that we saved for after hours.
So I didn't get a huge amount of data on this, but it seems like what I did get is referring to something incredibly ancient. It's like zooming out from planet Earth and looking at the whole timeline of Earth, maybe even the solar system, from a million miles away and outside of time. I drew like a big fat arrow in my session. I described it as the main stream. This thing has been inserted into this stream. And I drew, it's almost like it's been kind of unzipped at one end. And I said, a hole is made and something is put in. Digging around in there, it's delicate work. And I think this is almost like, I hesitate to say it, but that this is kind of outside of time. Or this is some kind of really alien, weird-ass context that I'm making a poor metaphor for in my session. So next I asked, what is this mainstream? Because I'd only described it in this metaphorical thread, stream, intervention along this thing, this timeline. I said, what is it? And I just drew a planet. I assume it's our planet. So looking at the creation event, it's in the distant past or even before what we would call the past. And it's very ambiguous. There's distant lands, which I guess is where this thing is. And I have a motion and some sort of energetic thing. I had an AOL of Lotus. There's a big multi-petals kind of light event sketch that I've done that is very unclear what any of this means. And it happens in this motion past the land, which I've described as a flyby. And this alters the land on the way past. After this has taken place, something is more focused, straight and simple in the motion. It's kind of deposited something in this location. I can't make any more of it out than that. I didn't dwell on this very much. I found out subsequently, I think that some of the data you have, Brett, kind of lines up and makes a bit more sense out of what I've got in my session, right?
Yeah, so the work I have on the origins and then ultimately the purpose, like why was this thing left here and why was this thing constructed? It begins with an association of peoples that appear humanoid. They don't seem any different really than us, but that the standard by which we would measure time is that this is very ancient. This was not done recently, and this was done way before anyone could possibly remember. And how it was made, it described in the data, there's an association of peoples that come together, and they have a very strange culture, but they come together and they breathe life into something, like using a defibrillator to power something up. And so the actual object itself, the artifact itself, seems to have been born rather than really created. And it was created through potentially thousands of life forms, all directing their conscious awareness on one specific point, and then it arose out of that point. And the descriptions of that point are, it's crystalline in nature, has its abalone in color, and that's what ultimately led into this automating, self-regulating mechanism that I believe exists at the top of the pyramid. But the actual individuals who did this or where they did this, the work is very similar to what you described, David, because it also describes that there's a dilemma here that some group is trying to solve. There is an inordinate amount of energy that's being hammered into the ground somehow. It's divisive and dividing and penetrating here. It slips right through. Something is grasping at it. there's a protrusion of a space envelope. It is in possession of two spaces at one time, a convergence of speed that is toppling something with great difficulty. This is a place of dominion and is likened to a realm of sorts. There's an Overwatch position nearby. So it's like a group of people or beings that all came together and through sheer conscious power and intention in time and in space, or we're trying to describe mechanics that we don't really understand. So it's just really basic vocabulary to describe something out there. They made this thing appear in our physical reality to be left over.
Now that we have a reasonably good sense of why it was built, let's shift gears maybe and talk about how, if we were to go there, how would people interact with this artifact? Because there's a lot of really interesting data. I know, Brett, when you were looking at this target, that was one of the taskings, that the retaskings you had for the remote viewers was actually, if you were to physically go there at this site and interact with this very special, very unique artifact, what would happen to you? Brett, do you want to lead us off with what your data had in that regard?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question, because the first thing we wanted to see if we could solve was, how do you interact with it? Because maybe it's not super straightforward. You get to a site, you need to dust it off because it's collected some muck and dirt over time, over the tens of thousands of years perhaps. But what would you do to interact with this thing in the first place? And then what happens when you interact with it? It works in a very similar way to something like a religious ceremony. Inside the pyramid, there appears to be a granite or rock formation that someone can position themselves in. I don't know if it's exactly carved out like a seat, but it's, for all intents and purposes, it's a seat. And there's actually little grooves that have been carved in the rock where you'd put your hand, where you basically position yourself in this kind of carved, smooth formation of the rock. And that's right in the middle of the pyramid. And so if you kind of just visualize this, seat is in the middle of the pyramid. It's a big open space. Directly above you is the point of the pyramid, and that's where this crystal is. And then there are these other positions around the seat that we just described as kind of like box seats. And that for this entire thing to actually operate correctly, you'd need other people there to support you. And we just called them the audience members, with love. And that if you didn't have these participants, is that they're actually integral for the whole thing to actually work. If you don't have people like close family members or compatriots that could shower you with love, this is a very spiritual kind of metaphysical process that actually goes on here once you're interacting, that it just, nothing would happen. You could sit in that seat, you could even put your hands where they needed to be, and then you'd just be sitting on a rock, and that's all that would happen. But you need these other individuals to help, for lack of a better word, power or get the thing started. And then once it gets started, that's where these automatic procedures take over that have been hardwired into the rest of this system to begin the process. So there's a stone seat. It's been carved out of a natural formation. An individual kneels here, placing their hands into small grooves in the rock. The connection acts as like a key that provides a chemical bond needed to start the process. In response, oscillating energies begin to circle the user, distorting and dilating the space in a spherical manner. Once a breaking point is reached, small flashing plasma orbs appear around the individual, which appear like little light bulbs sparkling with fire inside of them. So it seems like perhaps a chemical process and also a spiritual process at the same time.
Did you get a sense of how many people it actually required to activate this object? Was it like an odd number, an even number, a fixed number, or is it just more than yourself, two or more people sort of thing?
I think it takes 4 people total. In the drawings and sketches, it looked like there were 3 specific vantage points, which were official box seats for people to look down at the person who's undergoing the experience and project love at them. Seems like kind of a weird thing. How would me just looking at a person interacting with something and just feeling love towards them affect something? We're dealing with some pretty wild, quote unquote, technology here if that occurs. But it seems the human component of consciously perceiving someone else and holding them in love from these 3 other vantage points was necessary for this to work. And it seemed like a safety mechanism, actually, of why this is there, is that if someone were to just do this and was able to start this process by themselves, it would be highly dangerous, and they may not actually come out the other side intact.
After David had done his initial site work and it all sort of matched up with Brett's previous findings, I thought, let's also task David on what would happen to you, David, if you physically went to the site and successfully interacted with this object. And I know you got some very interesting results that seem to match some of the things that Brett found. Do you want to share that story with our listeners?
Sure. It's quite a short session. It gets very metaphysical almost immediately. My initial contact with the site, the very first perception I had was a light shining down on this kind of dark, somewhat odd place. I had an AOL of the nativity story, illuminated from above. So there was two main components to my session work on what would I experience here. There was this container that I described as instantaneous, like it didn't change throughout time. It was immutable and provided context or ground rules or constants. And in this way, it was a support structure. And I made the comparison that you need a number system before you can do arithmetic. This is somehow providing the building blocks or the limits of something else. And this wasn't limiting in a way of being constraining at all. These were helpful limits. Like you need to have a canvas before you can paint a picture. These were limits that were defining what was possible rather than limiting what wasn't. This thing is a constant in time or it's outside of time. It doesn't change. It's like a blueprint, a template, or a set of axioms. So this was the scene. This was this rather strange, dark place that I saw being illuminated by this light at the beginning of my session. And rising up from this context, there was something which it was difficult for me to put into words. This is a very metaphorical thing. We have a wave that's kind of like if you drop a pebble into a still pond, the waves radiate out in kind of rings. But this never stops in this process. The wave has that form, but it just keeps on going. It's a infinite wave extending outwards. It's a little bit like a standing wave, like you'd have inside a flute, where the wave stays in the same place and is continuous. We just have to, for the sake of the analogy, pretend that somebody plays a note on that flute forever. So I said it's kind of like how gravity works. Theoretically, everything in the universe, its gravity can affect everything else. There isn't a limit at which point gravity stops working. It just kind of gets weaker and weaker. And it's everywhere as a force. Looking into this container context thing from which this wave is born, I had an AOL of like the divine feminine, and Emily retasked me to unpack that AOL, and I said it's like a womb. It's surrounding, it has limits, but it's not constricting. Boundaries are helpful. It's firm but kind. It's the only place or way to go. It's singular, one of a kind, a highly abstract, metaphysical thing. I said, this is like the pond upon which there can be ripples, the substrate or prerequisite or progenitor. And this is quite hard to interpret in terms of what would the effects be upon me if I went to the Red Dog location and interacted with the artifact. Like, how do we make sense of what that would be like for me if, what does this even mean? And I think my best interpretation is that this is like an unlimiting of awareness or consciousness, that it would burst my bubble and whatever the metaphysical aspect of me is would then be unconstrained to kind of encompass the whole universe, which I think it ties in with some data you had, Brent, about the non-physical, the psychological stuff that happens, right?
Yeah, it does match up actually identically to some of the very specific details that I had in my project work. I got a little bit more of the mechanical processes as opposed to just only the metaphysical. To be honest, what you got is probably the most fascinating part of it. And some of the more mundane stuff is just building blocks to help kind of understand the process. So I'm going to go over this. And this is very much a metaphysical transformation process is what occurs here. But the data describes that this artifact interacts with people differently. That every person, if they were to sit down and interact with this object, they'd have a different kind of experience. It's personalized. Some would have a different outcome, some would be shown things that are a little bit different. Overall, it has the same overall effect of seemingly consciousness expanding, but it does seem to be very nuanced and specific and tailored towards the individual. So that's the first thing. However, what all the work was saying, and seems to match what you got, is when the device is actually successfully activated, there is a response by the artifact through what we described as an antenna that goes directly into the participant's mind. That the individual actually hears a voice in their head, and it's like they have this visual hologram that's being presented in front of them. And so something is communicating and interacting directly on a mind-to-mind level with them. What the project work described as occurring, what shows up in this communication and in these visualizations, is a catalog of civilization begins to stream out and is unpacked like a boxes from a museum. This is information from the past, which appears as visual diagrams drifting upwards like vapors in a vacuum. And this invokes the higher mind as obscured memories are relayed for the first time to the individual. New thought patterns and ideas are transplanted into the individual, and the volume and force of this event is monumental. The event itself is like repeatedly firing off a shotgun without ear protection. It's just an analogy. It's like the momentous energy and impact on the individual as they're experiencing these things is so great. It's just the force is nearly overwhelming. It's like being in the tempest of a storm and trying to withhold the energies of the wind and the water and the gyrating of the boat and all these things. It's like that. You're in the middle of the tempest because all this information is hitting you from past civilizations, about reality, about yourself, seemingly about perhaps past lives that you've had, the emotions that come with those lives. It's not just visual data, it's also experiential data. And so if you're getting full-on experiences that aren't your present day life, that could be all the happiness, all the sadness, all the anger, all the hatred, everything that you as a spiritual being have ever had comes to be witnessed. And that is intense. And perhaps that's why you need other people there holding you in love to be able to sustain that kind of impact.
That sounds a bit like what would happen if somebody tried to listen to every Cypher podcast episode all at once.
Yeah, you do it in bite-sized chunks. But this is a shortcut, I think, ultimately. This is not about spending 10 years to do an enlightening path. This is about buckle down, hook yourself in, and get ready for the wild ride.
This is funny, isn't it? Because everybody wants a shortcut so they can avoid doing their spiritual work. Right? We don't want to feel all the stuff we have to feel. We don't want to do our meditation. We don't want to have to deal with all our trauma and our bullshit. We don't want to do any of that. Everybody wants to just go and have a quick Reiki session and drink some special tea and have a cleansing bath. And nobody wants to actually go in there and do the work. And I often find myself saying to people, there is no shortcut. You can't cheat. You have to go in there, do that stuff and face up to it. And here we are saying, well, there is one thing you could do, but you still don't get away with it, do you? It's not, it speeds it up, but it doesn't save you from doing it. It just compacts it into such a short period of time.
That's probably one of the reasons you need this sort of loving support of the other individuals around you. It's almost like a therapy session where you're going to do some hard personal trauma healing, and you really need that supportive, compassionate therapist there for you to help you through that journey. And having that support team in place is essential.
Something that is possible to do, kind of as a tangent from the Red Dog site data, is if you do a lot of meditative work, a lot of psychical functioning work, a lot of clearing work, there are opportunities that sometimes present themselves to you as an individual where you begin to perceive past lives or past experiences that will percolate up when you're saying, why is it that I'm reacting negatively to some sort of stimuli or response, or the way someone is talking to me? And then you investigate it. And instead of getting oh, well, when I was 12 years old, it's because the tone my mother had with me, and that was the reason, and I formed a belief around it. What you actually get are images and experiences and emotions of a whole life that's altogether different from yours, that you have no conscious memory of, but is percolating and streaming up into your conscious awareness as the source of where this response or triggering is occurring from. And when you really do that successfully for the first time, it actually can be a pretty overwhelming thing because it's not just a picture, it's an experience. And if it's a traumatic experience that it was traumatic enough to transcend lives, that it's still impacting you to this day, then it's probably a really, really big event. And that means all of the emotions that are tied to that are going to come up with it. And I've had a lot of these over the past 5 years where these things started coming from me individually. When I started handling negative blocks in my own life, all these traumas are showing up from past lives. I don't know for certain it was past life. I don't have any data that suggests that. It seems to be that that's what these are, but the emotions are real. It's really weird when you're having memories of being someone else and you're getting the traumatic sensation of the emotion of the response that that person that's not you is going through, whether that's a death event, whether that's some other kind of betrayal event, could be any number of things. It's a really weird thing to be experiencing all these emotions that aren't yours. Maybe they are yours. It's just, it's not your present life that is responsible for them. And then taking this shortcut, like, yeah, maybe this is a short time cut, but it's not a short ease cut, because what this seems to be doing is it's compacting it all down into a singular event that the descriptions of the work, it was like this, like someone constantly is just firing a shotgun off right next to your ear. And it's not hitting you, it's the sound. The analogy was the reverb of the sound was so intense. You're right in the storm. And it's like you can barely hold on to your reality. You can barely hold on to yourself and your individuality because it's so intense.
How long does this actually take? I mean, you could spend decades at this doing it the old-fashioned way, but how much is that crammed into?
I don't know the exact length of time. If I were to guess based on the time I spent at site during this, that it could be anywhere from 45 minutes to a couple hours would be my guess. So I don't think you're doing this for days, but it's also not 5 minutes. This seems to be a sustained period of agony is maybe not the right word, but there's definitely a level of suffering that goes with this.
We're probably trying to think about these things in terms of our everyday perception of time. And it's also entirely possible that the people there at the site, inside of this almost energy bubble as this process is taking place, have a completely different perception of time themselves relative to our outside frame of reference. So there could be some sort of relative time frame reference thing going on. Don't know, but it seems like that's entirely possible.
Just going back to what you were saying about the nature of the experience, Brett, like the agony is not quite the right way to explain this. Is it more like emotional intensity? Because what's common in all approaches to this is you have to experience and feel all this stuff and kind of process it. And if you compress all of that emotional experience into a short time frame, it's just going to mean really intense emotional experiences of all different sorts, but presumably mostly unpleasant. Otherwise, why would they need removing?
Yeah, the summary goes like this. This process confronts the individual with something incredibly difficult to look at. This is like releasing the tides of war, where each plays a part. There is judgment here and the perception of fate. Great sadness is in their voice. It's like clenching the sharp edge of a dagger until a turning point is reached, whereby the images of demise and destruction may be released. And this is describing exactly the thing that happens when you go through the gauntlet of handling a really deep trauma is you have to actually witness it, see it right there, acknowledge there it is, there are the feelings, there are the emotions, be okay with it, and then finally let it go. And it's like that's what this is doing just on some really wild esoteric metaphysical level where you're getting it all at once. And I don't think it's even just your past lives. I think it's more that it's even greater than that. I feel like what this thing does is it goes all the way back to the inception of beingness in reality. What is reality? And perhaps, and this is a little bit of my speculating here, it's showing you reality without any distortion, the truth of it all from the very beginning of who and what you are and why you came here to even be you as a spiritual being. And there's likely some bumps and some challenges along the way to get to where you are now as a human being having a human experience. And it's showing you all of that without distortion so you can finally have it, acknowledge it, and let it go.
Our audience members might be asking themselves, some of you, if you're like me, you might be asking yourself, so this is a really, really amazing thing. Has anyone actually used it before? What are their ramifications if like I could physically go there? But do we actually think that somebody has already gone there and tried to use it, or will this happen in the future? Can we use our remote viewing powers to look into this? David, do you have any data in your sessions that suggest if people have looked at it or will look at it?
Yeah, implicitly, I moved to the period of peak operation, whatever that was, just because whenever I guess I hit it in the current time, and it was just mothballed and dusty and the equivalent of having sheets thrown over stuff. It was nothing was happening. It was completely dormant. So I moved myself, let's go to the peak, whatever it does when it's doing that the most. And I moved there, and there's a bunch of scientists there standing around this central feature in a room, and they're looking at their clipboards, doing whatever scientists do. And I was 32 pages into my session at this point, so I was at a point where I felt pretty comfortable going off piste and saying, let's just have a conversation with one of these guys and cut to the chase. So I said, hello, what are you doing here? And the scientist said, it's like a magnet. And I'm like, well, that's not a very useful response. How is it like a magnet? Attraction and repulsion, a vibrating aspect that may be emergent. We don't know where it comes from. So, okay, what are your goals, scientists? Something like fusion, maybe not fusion power, but something of that fundamental and significant nature. Big, powerful mysteries of science, weird science. I mentioned earlier about the pyramids and Soviet experiments for oil and gas extraction, so I had that in my head. So I asked, I said, has this got to do with oil and gas extraction? No, this is so much bigger than that, or it could be. So then I asked, what have you achieved to date? They said they measured some anomalies, but they want to work out how to make them bigger or more powerful. It's frustrating. We're working in the dark here. We don't have any idea how this works. So I said, well, do you have a personal theory? Like a hunch? No, not really. It seems very abstract and mathematical to me. It's like chasing shadows. Because we can't pin it down, I can't really believe it exists. Or I have no model in which to believe.
So it sounds like these scientists are not worthy of this super awesome consciousness technology. They just lack the conscious awareness of how to interact with this thing.
Well, conventional science is all about taking things to bits, isn't it? Can you imagine what a shame it would be, this incredible thing, if they turn up and they get the big crystal and they yank it out and they break all the stuff and they go and put it in the basement of the Smithsonian and they smash it all to bits, trying to dissect it and work out how it works. And all you needed to do was, like, sit down and feel the love, man. That's how science works. So next I asked this scientist, what do you want to tell us here in the future about your research? Which was dumb of me because I have no idea if we're in their future or if they're in our future. But anyway, that's what I asked. And the scientist said, I hope there's some conclusion to this. I hope someone cracks this mystery because it is infuriating to study. What conventional beliefs about physics specifically are challenged by your work so far? And they say, locality. There's action at a distance and we cannot identify the causal mechanism. It's impossible. And I ask, any other business, anything you want to add? And it's just good luck understanding this stuff. These people were completely stumped. They didn't have the tools to approach this.
I think it's interesting that you may or may not be in the past. And part of my postulate, and I think some of the data that we discussed at the beginning of the After Hours show was, when was this made and by who? What if it hasn't ever been used before, and then you task yourself with go to the time where the most people are there, well, if the first postulate is true, that it hasn't been used, that this has been injected into our timeline, that you actually went to the future after something has already happened there, and that there's this potentially a big event that scientists go there to try and figure out why that happened there, and they're stumped because they're like, wait, this happened here?
Well, the wording I used was move to peak operation time. So I think that's plausible to me that that could be what happened. Why would they be there looking for anomalies, right? This thing's dormant right now. So that makes sense. What I would have expected is go there when there's all this crazy spiritual stuff going on and some kind of levitating orbs and the world's most intense therapy session. But maybe the mechanics of this thing is that gets it warm and gets everything humming, and the guys go down there to look, and their teacup starts levitating, and it's like, oh, we should call the guys in white coats.
Yeah, well, it could be that there has never been any real activity other than the birth of the thing, but I don't think that was necessarily your intent. You were like looking, okay, when are the most people there? What if there never were people there? If the creation process of this thing was very paranormal and metaphysical, you didn't have 10,000 people down there with hammers and chisels making this thing, is that wouldn't have happened yet. And so therefore, perhaps the story goes something does happen in our future. And then that gets the interest by scientists in the future, which then go to, we need to study this thing, but they're stumped because they can't get it to happen again.
That makes sense to me. Some other data I had that supports the idea that it's never operated. So there's this idea of finding an optimal path or a sequence of moves or steps on a game board, kind of like how computers play chess by brute forcing a problem space. And there's a large number of time-limited iterations of this process. It hasn't reached a conclusion, but there's this motion through this process, and the result of it is it finds a low-energy state. It's like a key unlocking the door. They find the right key, and it produces a life which I described as hypothetical and abstract. This is a model which is only relevant within a specific conceptual niche. This is testable. We know what this would look like because of the constraints imposed by our understanding of its context. So that's saying, like, we know what this thing does, we know how it works, we know what effect it has on a person, but that person has never existed yet. This hasn't happened, right? We can predict what will happen when we go and switch this thing on, and what kind of strange person is going to step out of that process. Interestingly, I did note that there was spiritual stuff going on. I think I didn't go so far as to write down the word enlightenment, but I described it as a quiet emotional feeling of knowing. It's related to one thing merging into another. It's part of this process, spiritual.
So that's an interesting point and a really great segue to the rest of the data that I have. And it seems that depending upon who interacts with this device and this process, that the outcomes and even the experiences is going to be different. Like I mentioned before, it seems to be slightly tailor-made. In some of the sessions that were run, there's some additional features that seem to show up for these individuals. And one of them is a spiritual entity or being that, in the viewer's own words, this was actually my session, but it showed up in another one too, is that this being is like analogous to someone like Jesus Christ. It's someone who is so spiritually advanced, a being that is so ascended, for lack of a better word, that this being shows up at the site to help aid additional things that the person who's interacting with it might require or request. And part of the process was, and this is kind of like asked of the individual, would you like to see the world or see reality through my eyes? And when that's done, if agreed, there's this temporary merging process that occurs that allows the person to almost become them for a short period of time. And it just reminded me of what you just described there, of this merging process in your own work. It's my work says it wasn't permanent. It was a way to look at the reality through another lens that wouldn't be available. But there is this kind of commingling that can become an option for an individual should this other being be called to the site through the process, which it may happen for some, it may not happen for others.
I got a little more in-depth data about the merging. It was very hard to understand. I said, this is a very quiet, subtle feeling, spiritual meditation, enlightenment, peace, knowing, knowledge, a process, flowing. There was a lot of emotional stuff to this, which I even wrote a note. Why are we still in the emotional impact column? There was a lot of emotional stuff coming out about this part of the target. But then I described these two things which are kind of drawn together, and one merges into the other and goes within this boundary. It's like hidden behind the curtain. It's like cell membranes or white blood cells eating bacteria, this sort of glomming, hiding, wrapping round, enclosing thing. And then one interesting bit of data, which I still can't make sense of, is it follows an established model or form which overcomes problems with time.
All of that really reminds me of the work that I've seen come from Brett in terms of his initial sessions on this site. It matches up almost perfectly. It's really quite astounding. Brett, do you want to share with us the story after there's this sort of engagement with this potentially Jesus-like being? It seems like a bit of a menu of options, really, depending on who goes there and what they're ready for spiritually. And maybe you want to share that with our audience.
Yeah. So after the individual goes through this really intense session of therapy, perhaps to simplistically describe it, if the being shows up for that person, there does seem to be a question that's asked of them. And nothing is done against the individual's will. They're always asked, and it seems like it's designed to always make sure that everyone's on board and understands the consequences of any answers. But the person is asked, hey, there's this other thing over here. Let me show you what it looks like. It's an actual changing of genetic material of the individual into something else. And the being seems to ask the person if they're ready for that or want that. Would you like to go through that process? And the work describes that a genetic alteration may be proposed to the user during the interaction with the artifact and the being. If accepted, the individual is infused with something that reminds the viewer of a proto-material that resembles a tulip bulb, so just a visual for it. The user is then projected and moved to somewhere else in the facility, and they seem to, for lack of a better word, be taken into a biological system, and a rebirth process ensues. This development follows a rhythmic pattern, and a certain timing is needed here for this to take place. This appears to the viewer as something nothing short of a miracle taking place. I think what my takeaway from this work is describing is that there's an option available to actually make a physical genetic change to the person after they've gone through this process of seeing reality without distortion, seeing past lives, seeing all this stuff. And that if they want it, they don't have to take it, but if they want it, they can go through this transformative process that potentially unlocks nascent DNA in the human body, and it turns the individual into something more than what we would consider human now. And that once they came out through the other side of that process, it seems like it takes a period of time. It's like almost a rebirthing process with a different kind of physical body, that once they came out the other side of that, they would have new options available to them as far as to what part of reality they would wish to participate in.
Do you think that in addition to this sort of physical rebirthing process to, for lack of a better word, unlock latent features like human plus or whatever, there would also be a non-physical unlocking of abilities? There would be a metaphysical sort of change to go along with that. Does that make sense?
100%. I think that's exactly what would happen. And the reason why I believe that is because the person on the other side of that experience is no longer looking at their life and even their experience as a human in the same way. And there's actually a bit of a loss that on the other side of the experience, it's like someone who's on a boat and they're seeing their loved ones and their friends on the shore, and they're going off to the new world. where their friends can't join them, their family can't join them. And there's actually a really deep, profound sadness that the being, after transcending and going through this biological change, has, where they have to let go of who they had been up to this point to then move into this new type of experience in a new world. And I don't think they would hang around Earth. They're not going down to the bank and working a 40-hour week job. They're moving somewhere else. And I think that's what ties back into this idea of this entire device acts like a raft or a lifeboat to then ascend or move in to some other part of reality.
So there's an idea here which we can find cropping up in multiple different places, which is the idea of rebirth, spiritual rebirth, and physical death and rebirth used as a metaphor in the cases I'm talking about for that. Seems like what we have here is a literal death and rebirth, which is not the norm. On the exoteric, you have the born again Christians, but in occult practices, there are initiation rites and rituals which can be performed to try and bring about a kind of spiritual rebirth. And there's also rebirth and the changing of self and the casting aside of things as part of the natural spiritual development process. And the idea of becoming a new person by losing things which are holding you down, say in the Buddhist model, I think it would say you're freeing yourself from attachments because you're kind of untangling all these threads that keep you desperately concerned about certain earthly matters. You know, this seems like this idea of rebirth taken to the absolute extreme is what we're seeing here.
I have my own sort of intuitions about this process, and from looking at all the data that Brett has accumulated and David has as well on this, I'm getting a sense that this isn't just breaking free of the regular death and birth recycling program on Earth. This device seems to me like it's a vast leveling up. I don't know, Brett. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's my impression of it as well. Is if you have the ability to handle the duress or the trauma, the witnessing of the truth, if you have the consciousness capability, like your cup is big enough to handle all of that, that this avails itself to say, hey, you could speed up the time needed to get there. And I think a slingshot is a great analogy. In the work we used the word, it's like a roller coaster where you're just speeding. It goes up, 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 and then swoosh down crazy fast into this new aspect of reality. But because it moves you so far and so quickly from where you are right now, what we got is that you could not even, and you would not want to even interact with those that you've known up to this point. It's almost like you have to let go of your family and what that means, and your friends and being human. And that there's a sadness there. It's a profound one. It's not an agonizing sadness, but it's imagine if you were given an opportunity, hey, would you like to go travel the universe? And someone shows up at your doorstep, but to do so, you'll never return to Earth, ever. How many people would say yes to that? Probably not a lot, but that's what this would do if someone chose it.
I'm guessing that includes you'd have to give up like your social media accounts, you'd lose all your Twitter followers, you'd lose all your Instagram followers. That may be hard for some people.
Yeah, you lose your bank account and all your earthly possessions. They wouldn't mean anything to you anymore. And part of the data seemed to suggest that even if for whatever reason you wanted to hang around, you still really couldn't, just due to the things that unlocked from a genetic level. It's like you have a new vehicle you're operating in, and it's no longer the same thing as a human body. And because of that, it doesn't fit in the Earth life paradigm. And so because you'd probably, to be honest, from what seems possible on the other side of this, you'd be worshipped as a god, which is the very last thing that you'd want if you were in that kind of ascended conscious state. Like, it's a total dysfunction of what you probably witnessed and now finally understood clearly. I don't even know what that means because I haven't gone through the process, but you wouldn't want to stay here because it would get perverted and distorted, and you would lead others into a potential trap if you just stayed around. I mean, one of the data points that I had in my work is that if someone were to look at your new form, your new physical body directly in the eyes, that your eyes would be so bright. There'd be so much light emanating from your eyes, from your face, that it would blind anyone who witnessed the way you looked. You wouldn't hang around here. You'd go somewhere else. And I think that's what this avails you to, which is why it's like getting on the boat and going to the new world and saying goodbye to your family forever. I mean, this has happened in human history. When explorers did that, this is on a different level.
What's really stands out to me from what you just said, Brett, is there are references to things like this in biblical texts, angelic beings. You can't even look at them directly. It's just interesting to me that there are these connections in all of our inherited religious teachings, and it matches up with this data we found.
Well, if time is not as linear as we think it is, perhaps this site and this artifact is used by humans in the future. What's to suggest that if you were to engage with it on that level, that you couldn't go back in time and those stories were actually created not sequentially? That all of the angelic beings that fit this description would have they're all beings that in the future have come out through this life raft of the red dog artifact. It's a wild speculation, but it's a funny one to think about.
So I want to ask both of you what you think about, are people of all the people that are listening to this show right now, in the course of maybe their average lifetime, do you actually expect there to be individuals who physically go to this place and physically interact with the object? How do you think that would play out in broader society? Would it just get sort of buried under the rug? Would it be this massive social change that takes place? What do you think?
Well, we actually ran a follow-up project years later on this, which was we looked at the most significant short-term global impact once this site was uncovered and then actually someone engaged with it. We saw small groups of people being led there by those who had gone through it, not the actual transformation biological process, but that had gone through the awakening process where they see reality without distortion. They kind of acted as a guide for these groups of people that wanted to go with them and experience it as well. And so it was almost like, come on an expedition, but this is a spiritual expedition, but you're going to need your Indiana Jones hat. So like a pilgrimage of sorts. We didn't see anything much larger than that, but we did describe pilgrimages occurring with guides, and the guides were some of the first people that actually were able to successfully operate it, but they didn't leave reality like is the option for some. They now have, I'm sure, a very interesting perspective on reality, and they help others navigate and get there and go through it as well if they so desire. So it's kind of like a guru helping someone up the mountain is what we described.
So, Emily, you tasked me what would happen if I personally went there and what would the effects be on me. And I described this expanded consciousness experience, right? So I got to assume from that I do not choose to be reborn into some strange godlike figure, and that I would stop short of the physical rebirth process, assuming I ever did go, which I hope I do. It sounds super cool. But Brett, have you remote viewed what you would do if you went? Would you make that choice?
Well, of the 4 people that remote viewed this originally, myself included, 2 of us had that come up and 2 of us didn't as an option. So I didn't remote view whether or not I would choose it, but it did show up as an option if I wanted it. And whether or not I would actually choose it, I think is a to be determined type of a thing. I don't know. Part of me says yes, though. It's another wild adventure.
Another interesting implication of people actually having at least experienced the kind of psychedelic mind expanding journey, it makes me wonder if those individuals then wouldn't themselves have some sort of knowledge as to how to help others, possibly even without the artifact. So it makes me wonder if this site itself isn't a bit more like a seed of what's possible, as opposed to you physically must all go there to experience this.
Yeah, I don't think tens of thousands of people are doing this pilgrimage. I think what makes more sense, and just in what my gut intuition is telling me about it, is that those who do originally experience it and then come back to society with very profound understandings, is they probably would become something like roaming teachers and they would have followings and essentially, oh no, are we dealing with a cult now? I don't know. Maybe a new religion would potentially arise from those who've gone through the experience. And then those that are coming back with these understandings, they would have the clarity to be able to know who could go there and actually benefit from the actual experience itself. And that's why we saw small groups as opposed to there wasn't a line going from there all the way down to your local city. It was very few small groups, and they seemed very almost religious journey for these people.
Well, if you think the majority of people don't really deeply engage with the overtly spiritual mission at any point throughout their lifetime, and going to this place is going to be an arduous and expensive task for anybody. So it's a small subset of a small subset of people who this is even going to be accessible to.
Yeah, definitely. I do think, though, based off the work and this, when we looked at, well, what's the most significant short-term global impact, there was one other piece of data that I think was very clear in that once this was used for the first time, that it would herald in a new paradigm. And so things would change. This would not be a secretive thing, as that something would expand outwards from this site and people would know about it. So I don't see this being a secret society, keeping it to themselves, leveling up. Aha, you don't know, you're not in our group. That was not the purpose of why this was put there, nor do I think that that is actually what would occur.
No, those people wouldn't even be able to activate it. The people who are doing it for like an ego reason. Look how awesome I am. Look how terrible everyone else is. I think that's a type of consciousness that just would be like, no, sorry, you're getting kicked out. I don't know if there's a penalty for trying this process if you're not worthy, but it could end badly for those who aren't in the right space.
Those people are like automatically excluded from the secrets, the mysteries, and the fruits of higher levels of development, right? The whole point of spiritual development is overcoming all of that dumb stuff. So people worry about keeping secrets, but actually the real secrets, they keep themselves. You can tell people what they are, and it doesn't matter. They still won't know. So I want to add one little anecdote to the end, because Brett, earlier on, you said when you sit down in the chair, there's flashing orange orbs appear, right? And I hadn't heard that described before. I haven't heard you mention it or anything. Last night, I had a dream where I was talking to somebody who suggested to me, in a kind of like looking down their nose at me, like, come on, do your work, that I should be spending the weekend in prayer and meditation like they would be. And at the end of the dream, there was a flashing orange orb that kind of went boo and flew away. And I have never in my life seen a flashing orange orb with my eyes closed before, and never flashing orbs or orange or anything. And then you said that today, and I'm like, the hell? Maybe I've spent too long connected to this thing, and now the void is staring back into me. That's crazy. Perhaps it's advising me to get my house in order before I visit in a few years.
Yeah, get yourself ready. That's pretty wild. I mean, these kind of synchronicities don't surprise me at all. Maybe one day you will show up there, and you have some more meditative work to do beforehand, David. Hop to it.
I'm terribly lazy. I don't do my work. Do as I say, not as I do.
Well, all in due time, and I think this is the time to end this After Hours episode. So thank you, everybody, for joining us on this wild adventure into Project Red Dog and the mysterious undiscovered artifact in North America. This has been kind of a labor of love for me over several years. This was not one project for me. These were projects that I ran or was a part of over several years of looking at this. There's thousands upon thousands of pages of remote viewing data I have on this site. And there's even more that we didn't go into today about descriptions of other things that are there, about things that you should be aware of if you were to go. There's so much data I have, location data, but it's just been this really fun mystery that I just had this personal attraction to. And maybe I just have this deep-seated desire to don my Indiana Jones hat and go find the ancient relics in an underground lair from the ancient past. I don't know. I mean, I certainly, if I go, I'm going to bring one of those hats and maybe a leather vest too. I guess we'll see. But thank you everybody for joining us on this After Hours episode. Definitely give us a like and a subscribe. You can find us on social media. This Cypher Podcast. Share this with your friends, and we really do appreciate you supporting us by being a subscriber. So until our next episode, take care.